The courtroom was packed, as it always was on a busy Monday morning. The sound of papers rustling and the murmur of low conversation filled the air as Judge Harrison took his seat at the bench. With a stern look and a swift motion, he called the next case. Tanisha Carter, the clerk announced, and all eyes shifted to the woman standing at the front of the room. Tanisha was a striking presence, her posture straight, her expression calm but assertive. She was dressed in a simple yet professional outfit, black slacks and a blouse. Nothing flashy, but her confidence was undeniable. She walked to the front without hesitation, maintaining eye contact with the judge. Judge Harrison glanced up from his paperwork, sizing her up. Tanisha was the kind of person who carried herself with dignity, and that was both impressive and, in his mind, a bit unsettling. He had seen countless people like her in his years on the bench. People who seemed too composed, too sure of themselves. It often made him wonder if they thought they were above the system. In the back of his mind, he labeled her as someone who had likely made a small mistake, but was now trying to play the victim. "Ms. Carter, you've been charged with a traffic violation," Judge Harrison said, his voice loud and commanding. "Failure to yield to a pedestrian. Do you have an explanation?" Tanisha's response was calm, measured. "Your Honor, I did stop for the pedestrian, but there was a second vehicle blocking my view. I couldn't see the person crossing until I was already moving, but I immediately slowed down and ensured I didn't cause harm." Judge Harrison didn't seem to pay much attention to the details of her explanation. He had already made up his mind. He reviewed her file briefly before looking back up at her. "While I understand your explanation, I've seen this happen time and again," he said dismissively, tapping his gavel on the desk. "The fine for this kind of violation is $250. I'm imposing it today. You should be more cautious in the future, Ms. Carter. It's a simple matter of following the rules of the road." Tanisha didn't flinch. She held her ground, knowing how these situations often unfolded. She had encountered many unfair moments in her life, but this one was different. She could feel the weight of the judge's quick judgment. His eyes never left her, almost as if daring her to argue further. "I understand, Your Honor," she said evenly. There was no anger in her voice, only a quiet resolve. "But I believe that when we are diligent about justice, we must ensure that it's not only about following rules, but also about understanding the context in which those rules are applied." Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow, clearly uninterested in continuing a discussion he felt unnecessary. He turned away and wrote down his ruling without another word. "Court is adjourned," he said, banging his gavel. Tanisha quietly turned and walked out of the courtroom, her mind already shifting to the next task she had ahead of her. As she walked through the halls of the courthouse, she couldn't help but wonder how many others faced the same kind of judgment. Quick, unfair, and based on assumptions. She wasn't angry, but she knew one thing for sure. The system needed change, and she was ready to do her part. As Tanisha stepped outside the courthouse, the crisp morning air hit her face, offering a brief moment of relief. She paused for a moment, collecting herself. The fine wasn't the issue. It was the principle. She knew the judge had made his decision based on his own biases rather than the facts. But she had learned long ago that these battles weren't always fought in the courtroom. They were fought on the ground, one small step at a time. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen. An incoming call from her assistant, Lucas. "Tanisha, the meeting's starting in 10 minutes. Are you on your way?" Lucas's voice crackled through the line, tinged with concern. Tanisha sighed, rolling her shoulders back. She'd almost forgotten about the Army's Legal Ethics Division meeting. Despite her recent frustration with the courtroom, she had a responsibility that far exceeded the trivialities of traffic violations. Her role was crucial in ensuring legal integrity within the military. She didn't have the luxury of staying upset for long. "I'll be there in 15, she replied, her voice steady. "Cancel the lunch reservation, please, and have the team prep the documents for the compliance review. We need to be thorough today." She didn't wait for his response, hanging up before the words even registered. Her mind shifted quickly. The Army's legal department wasn't something she could afford to put on hold, not even for a moment. She'd earned her position through years of dedication and hard work, making sure that the military upheld the highest standards of legal ethics. Every day, she worked tirelessly to ensure the system was fair, transparent, and just, things that had clearly been missing from her brief encounter with Judge Harrison. As Tanisha navigated through the busy streets, her thoughts lingered on the incident. She knew there were moments when people like Judge Harrison would dismiss her or overlook her contributions, not understanding the depth of her role. But that was fine. It didn't matter what he thought about her now. What mattered was the work she was doing behind the scenes, and more importantly, the ripple effects it had on the larger legal landscape. She reached her car and slid into the driver's seat, adjusting the rearview mirror. The weight of her responsibilities was always present, but today it felt heavier. There were people she needed to support, reforms she had to fight for, and young officers and lawyers she needed to mentor. The stakes were high, and there was no time for distractions. The car hummed to life as she pulled away from the curb. Her mind moved back to the task at hand. The Army's review of military legal protocols, the compliance checks, and ensuring that legal officers remained accountable for their actions. These were the moments that truly mattered. Not a traffic violation, not a courtroom misunderstanding. These were the battles that could change things on a larger scale. She drove toward the Army base, her resolve growing stronger with each passing mile. The day ahead was going to be challenging, but she was ready. In fact, she was more than ready. She had a purpose, and no one, especially not a judge who couldn't see beyond his biases, was going to take that away from her. Later that evening, after the day's cases had been settled, Judge Harrison sat alone in his chambers. The courtroom had been unusually quiet after Tanisha's case. His ruling felt final, yet something about the encounter lingered in his mind. He glanced over the stack of papers on his desk, but found it hard to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the woman who had stood before him with such poise. Tanisha Carter, who was she really? Judge Harrison had met plenty of defendants over the years, but none like her. She hadn't flinched when he imposed the fine. She hadn't argued or raised her voice, even though it was clear from the way she spoke that she wasn't accepting his judgment as fair. There was something different about her, something he couldn't quite place. His eyes drifted to the stack of invitations he had received that day, one of which was printed on official Army letterhead. He had briefly glanced at it earlier, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, with his curiosity piqued, he picked it up again. It was an invitation to a legal ethics seminar hosted by the Army, and the name of the keynote speaker jumped out at him. Tanisha Carter, the same woman he had found earlier that day. For a moment, the information didn't quite register. He read the letter again, more carefully this time. Tanisha wasn't just anyone. She was the head of the Army's Legal Ethics Division. The letter outlined her accomplishments, highlighting her extensive work in ensuring that military personnel adhered to the highest standards of legal conduct. She was someone who shaped policy, who influenced major decisions in the military's legal system. And now she was coming to speak about legal ethics, his own specialty. A deep sense of unease began to settle over him. Judge Harrison had spent his career priding himself on his expertise in law and ethics, yet here was a woman, someone he had dismissed in a matter of minutes, who was not only far more accomplished than he had initially realized, but also in a position to influence military legal procedures on a national scale. How had he missed all of that? He turned to his computer, quickly researching Tanisha Carter's background. The more he read, the more he felt the weight of his own ignorance. Tanisha had a distinguished career in law, but more than that, she had dedicated her life to ensuring justice was not just served, but served equitably. Her leadership in legal ethics wasn't just theoretical, it was deeply rooted in practical reform. Judge Harrison felt a knot in his stomach. He had dismissed her as just another defendant, a simple case. Yet Tanisha was far from ordinary. The realization stung. He hadn't just made a mistake in the courtroom. He had underestimated someone who, in many ways, was his equal, or perhaps, in some respects, his superior. As the evening wore on, he sat back in his chair, grappling with the dissonance between his actions and the reality of who Tanisha Carter was. He knew he needed to apologize, but something told him that an apology alone wouldn't be enough. Tanisha had taught him an important lesson, whether she intended to or not. The next day, he would find a way to make things right, if that was even possible. But for now, he had to reckon with one undeniable truth. Tanisha Carter was someone who deserved respect, and not just because of her role in the Army, but because of who she was as a person. And he had missed that entirely. The seminar was held in a sleek, modern conference room at an Army training facility just outside the city. Judge Harrison arrived early, hoping to gather his thoughts before the session began. He still felt uneasy about his interactions with Tanisha the day before, and he wasn't sure what to expect from the upcoming seminar. As more attendees trickled in, he took a seat near the back of the room, trying to remain inconspicuous. The room buzzed with conversation, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the moments in the courtroom when he had made his hasty decision. He had judged Tanisha too quickly, and now he was about to meet the person behind the name, someone with a depth of experience that far outstripped his own understanding of ethics and law. The room grew quieter as the seminar's start time approached, and the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd as Tanisha Carter stepped onto the stage. Judge Harrison watched her closely, noting her confident stride, the grace with which she held herself. She wasn't just a woman in a professional setting. She was commanding, yet calm, and her presence filled the room with an undeniable authority. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice clear and strong, carrying easily across the room. "It's an honor to be here with you today to talk about something that, at its core, defines not only our careers, but our personal integrity, legal ethics." Judge Harrison leaned forward, intrigued. This wasn't the Tanisha he had encountered in the courtroom. The woman before him was a force, a seasoned professional who had worked tirelessly to change the way the military handled legal matters. She spoke with authority, but also with empathy, drawing on her experiences both within the legal world and in her personal life. Tanisha began to speak about the importance of ensuring that legal professionals, whether military or civilian, upheld the highest ethical standards. She described situations where small lapses in judgment could lead to catastrophic consequences. Her examples were both powerful and relatable, showing how ethics weren't just abstract concepts, but practical principles that shape real lives. Judge Harrison listened closely, captivated by her insights. She was far more than just a legal expert. She was a visionary. The more she spoke, the more he felt the weight of his earlier actions. Her words about bias, judgment, and accountability resonated deeply with him. He realized how often he had relied on his own assumptions in the courtroom without considering the larger picture, the deeper context. Tanisha spoke not just about the importance of upholding the law, but about the responsibility every legal professional had to ensure fairness and impartiality. She talked about her role in overseeing military legal ethics, making sure that military lawyers followed the principles of justice, even when under pressure. When the seminar concluded, the room filled with applause. Tanisha stood tall, nodding her appreciation to the audience, but Judge Harrison could sense that she wasn't here for accolades. She was here to share her knowledge, to instigate change, and to make a difference in a field that desperately needed it. As the crowd began to filter out, Judge Harrison remained seated. He knew he had to speak to her. It wasn't just about apologizing. It was about learning from her, understanding how his own approach had to evolve. Tanisha, noticing him lingering at the back of the room, made her way toward him, her expression unreadable. Judge Harrison stood to greet her, his heart beating faster than usual. This was it, the conversation he had been dreading, but also, in a way, anticipating. "Judge Harrison," she said, her voice even but not unkind, "I didn't expect to see you here." He swallowed, a bit uncomfortable but determined. "Miss Carter, "I owe you an apology," he began, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I was wrong in the courtroom yesterday. I didn't see the full picture, and I should have." Tanisha nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. She didn't speak immediately, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "It's a good start," she said at last, her tone measured. "But understanding the full picture is only the beginning. The real work comes after that." Judge Harrison nodded, understanding that his journey toward change was only just beginning. The room had quieted as the last few attendees filtered out, leaving Tanisha and Judge Harrison standing together in the corner, the low hum of conversation fading into the background. The apology was out there now, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Harrison wasn't focused on defending himself. Instead, he was finally listening. Tanisha was silent for a moment, studying him with a quiet intensity. She had always been one to carefully assess a person's words, to feel out their intentions before responding. She appreciated that the judge had acknowledged his mistake, but she was aware that true change didn't come from a single apology. It came from action. "I can see you're sincere, Judge," Tanisha finally said, her voice calm but resolute. "But you have to understand, it's not just about saying you're sorry. It's about recognizing why you acted the way you did, and making a commitment to change that behavior moving forward." Judge Harrison felt a twinge of discomfort at her words, but he didn't shy away. He had spent decades on the bench, carefully constructing his reputation as a judge of firm principles. He was proud of his record, until now. He had prided himself on being fair and efficient, but Tanisha's words had cut through that pride like a blade, exposing a truth he wasn't ready to admit. He hadn't been as fair as he had thought. He hadn't truly listened. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter now, almost contemplative. "I didn't see the full picture yesterday. I made an assumption about you, about your role, without bothering to ask any questions or look deeper. I've done that before. Maybe too many times." Tanisha nodded, her gaze softening. "It's easy to fall into that trap. We all do it, especially those of us in positions of power. We assume that because we know the rules, we know the people who come before us. But what we often forget is that the law is meant to be applied impartially, not just in theory, but in practice. Every decision we make has a ripple effect." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Judge Harrison found himself feeling vulnerable. He had always believed in justice, but the concept of truly seeing the people behind the cases he ruled on, that was something he had never given much thought to. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted, glancing down at his hands. "I've always been focused on the rules, the procedures. It's easy to forget that there's a person standing in front of you, with their own story." Tanisha smiled faintly. "We all get caught up in the system. But the system works best when we remember that it's about people, about fairness, not just efficiency." For a long moment, there was silence between them, the weight of their shared understanding settling like a quiet tension in the room. Harrison knew he had a long road ahead of him, but something within him had shifted. Tanisha had helped him see the cracks in his approach, the moments where he had chosen convenience over fairness. "I need to do better," he said, his voice firm now, as though he had made an internal vow. "I'm going to start questioning myself more, making sure I'm not just following protocol for the sake of it. I'll work on truly understanding the people I'm judging, all of them." Tanisha regarded him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if measuring the sincerity of his words. "I hope you do, Judge. It's not about just being right. It's about being just." Judge Harrison nodded, the weight of that distinction sinking in deeply. He knew his next steps wouldn't be easy. He would have to confront his biases, examine his habits, and be open to learning from people like Tanisha, people who saw the complexities others often ignored. Before he could speak again, Tanisha offered one final piece of advice, her tone practical yet caring. "If you're truly committed to change, you need to keep pushing yourself," she said. "It's a lifelong process, and I'll be here if you ever need someone to talk to." Harrison's eyes lifted to meet hers, and for the first time, he felt something other than professional distance. He felt gratitude. For the first time, he didn't feel like the judge who had all the answers. He felt like a person, someone who could grow, evolve, and become better. "Thank you, Tanisha," he said, his voice low but filled with respect. "I won't forget this." With a slight nod, Tanisha turned to leave, her mission still clear, but for the first time, she knew that the seeds of change had been planted in someone she least expected, someone who might just be able to make a difference in his own way. And for Judge Harrison, the journey toward true justice was just beginning. After the seminar, the days seemed to blur together for Judge Harrison. He threw himself back into his usual routine, trying to focus on his caseload and keeping up appearances, but something had shifted within him. Tanisha's words echoed in his mind constantly, urging him to question the assumptions he had relied on for so long. That night, as he sat in his office, the familiar pile of case files before him seemed inconsequential. His mind wandered back to Tanisha's words. "It's not just about being right. It's about being just." What did that really mean? Had he been so concerned with the letter of the law that he had lost sight of its spirit? The more he thought about it, the more disillusioned he became with his own judgments. He had prided himself on being efficient, on ruling quickly and decisively. Yet, over the years, he had also made countless assumptions about the people who came before him. Tanisha's case was just one example of that. He had not bothered to understand her context, her perspective. He had assumed she was just another person trying to game the system. A pang of guilt hit him as he thought about the many others who had crossed his courtroom in similar circumstances. How many had suffered because of his snap judgments? How many had walked away, feeling the sting of an unfair ruling, just as Tanisha had? He sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The weight of his responsibility was suddenly overwhelming. He had the power to shake people's lives, and yet he had been too focused on efficiency to truly consider the impact of his decisions. He had forgotten that his role wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about ensuring fairness, about ensuring that justice was served with compassion. Judge Harrison stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. The lights of the streets below flickered in the distance, a metaphor for the clarity he was beginning to find in his own mind. He had been so caught up in his own image of the law as an impersonal, rigid system that he had neglected the humanity behind each case. Every person who stood before him had a story, a history, a reason for why they were there. His job wasn't just to apply rules. It was to understand, to weigh those rules with empathy, and to consider the greater context. The realization was profound, and he knew it was going to take time to change. He couldn't expect to be different overnight. He would need to engage with his own biases, confront the assumptions that had governed his judgments for so long. But the key, he understood now, was to stay open, to be willing to listen, not just to the law, but to the people affected by it. The next day, Judge Harrison began his work with renewed purpose. He attended a seminar on implicit bias, something he had brushed off in the past as unnecessary. He read books on restorative justice, searching for ways to ensure that he was not just a figure of authority, but a true agent of fairness. He even reached out to Tanisha, asking if she could recommend further resources on ethics and legal reform. It wasn't easy. Every ruling, every decision, now came with an added weight as he questioned his own motives, his past behavior. But he was determined. He knew he had a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, he felt the possibility of real change. And it all began with a single moment of self-reflection, one that had been sparked by Tanisha Carter, someone who had challenged his assumptions and made him realize that justice wasn't about being right. It was about being truly fair. It was weeks after the seminar, but Judge Harrison had already started making noticeable changes in the way he approached his cases. His courtroom demeanor had softened, his decisions more thoughtful. He took extra time to listen, to ask questions, and most importantly, to see the people standing before him, not just as defendants or plaintiffs, but as human beings with unique circumstances. One afternoon, A case came before him that would test these new habits. A young man named Marcus Williams stood in the dock, accused of drug possession. It was a typical case, one Harrison would have ruled on swiftly without a second thought in the past. But today, something felt different. As Marcus nervously shuffled in front of the bench, Harrison studied him for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Williams," he began, his tone measured but not unkind, "before we proceed, I want to understand a bit more about your situation. I've read your file, but that only tells me part of the story." Marcus, visibly taken aback by the question, looked up at the judge. "Your Honor, I made a mistake," he began hesitantly. "But I've been trying to turn my life around. I got caught up in the wrong crowd a few years ago, but I've been in rehab. I'm working now, trying to make things right." Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully, his gaze steady. It was the kind of story he'd heard many times before, but now, instead of rushing to judgment, he allowed the words to settle in the air. "You've made mistakes, but you're trying to change," Harrison said, his voice softer than usual. "I respect that, but I also need to know if you truly understand the consequences of your actions, not just for you, but for your community." Marcus nodded, his voice steadier now. "I do. I've seen the impact of my past on my family, my friends. I don't want to go back to that life. I want to do something better, something positive." Harrison sat back in his chair, absorbing the young man's words. In the past, he would have focused on the legal details, the offense, the evidence, the laws to be upheld. Today, however, he couldn't ignore the possibility that this was someone who deserved more than just a punishment. "All right," the judge said after a pause. "I'm going to order a reduced sentence with a focus on rehabilitation. You'll be required to complete a community service program and continue your rehab. But know this, Mr. Williams, this is an opportunity, not a free pass. If you squander it, there will be consequences." Marcus looked up, his eyes wide with gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't let you down. I promise." The courtroom murmured with surprise at the unexpected ruling. Some were confused, others impressed, but Harrison was sure of his decision. He had taken the time to listen, to understand, and to look beyond the crime to the person in front of him. It wasn't about being harsh, it was about being just. He wasn't letting Marcus off easy, but he was giving him a chance to prove that he could do better. As Marcus left the courtroom, his shoulders a little lighter, Harrison felt a small sense of pride. It wasn't that he had solved all of Marcus' problems in a single ruling, but he had done something more important. He had treated him with dignity. Later that day, Tanisha called to check in, as she often did. When Harrison shared the details of the case with her, she listened quietly, then offered a few words of encouragement. "You did good, Judge. You didn't just follow the law. You applied it with empathy. That's what true justice is." Harrison smiled at her words, knowing that he still had a long way to go. But for the first time in years, he was starting to believe that real change was possible. One case, one person, at a time. And he knew Tanisha would be there, whether as a mentor, a colleague, or just a voice of reason, guiding him as he continued his journey toward becoming the kind of judge he had always aspired to be. Justice, he now understood, wasn't just about the verdict. It was about the heart behind it. Months passed, and Judge Harrison's transformation became more evident. He had immersed himself in learning, attending workshops on bias, restorative justice, and ethics in the legal system. His interactions with defendants became more compassionate, his rulings more thoughtful. The courtroom had shifted from a place of mere judgment to a space where people's stories were heard and their lives considered before a decision was made. One morning, Tanisha arrived at the courthouse for a scheduled meeting with Harrison. She had been watching his progress from afar, impressed with how far he had come since that fateful day in the seminar. She had always believed that change in the system began with individuals, and Harrison's transformation was proof of that. When she stepped into his chambers, she found him going over a case file, his usual stoic demeanor replaced by a look of focus and care. He looked up when she entered, offering her a smile. "Tanisha, it's good to see you," he said, standing to greet her. "I've been meaning to catch up with you. There's been a lot on my mind." Tanisha smiled back, but her eyes were keen, as if already sensing the shift in him. "I can see that. You've been busy, I take it." Harrison nodded. "More than usual. But it's different now. I'm taking the time to really understand the people who come before me. It's not just about the law anymore. It's about making sure the law serves everyone, not just those who can navigate it with ease." Tanisha took a seat, her expression soft but serious. "I'm glad to hear that. But you've learned something important, haven't you?" "I have," Harrison said quietly, his voice tinged with humility. "It's not about making quick judgments. It's about seeing the person behind the case. When you really listen, when you try to understand their lives, their struggles, it changes how you see everything. The law isn't just black and white. It's messy, complex, and sometimes it requires a level of empathy that I never allowed myself before." Tanisha nodded, her eyes shining with approval. "That's exactly it. The law can be a tool for justice, but only if we're willing to use it with compassion and understanding. I'm proud of you, Judge. You've come a long way." Harrison paused, his eyes meeting hers. "I couldn't have done it without you, Tanisha. You showed me what true justice looks like, and I think I've only just scratched the surface. I've been so focused on the rules, on my own image as a judge, that I never really asked myself how I could make a real difference. But now, I understand. I want to help make the system better, not just in theory, but in practice." Tanisha leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "It's going to be a long road, but you've made the first step. You're no longer just judging people, you're helping them. And that's what the law should always be about." Harrison smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "I still have a lot to learn, but I'm ready for the challenge." The two of them stood together, a quiet understanding passing between them. For the first time, Harrison felt confident not just in his rulings, but in his purpose. He was no longer just a judge passing down verdicts. He was a man committed to ensuring fairness and justice for all, no matter the case or the individual. As Tanisha left the courthouse, Harrison watched her go, feeling the sense of hope that he hadn't felt in years. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he knew he was on the right one. And in that moment, he realized that true justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that would continue with every case, every decision, and every person he had yet to meet.